All right, so now let's get into blood volume. We're going to talk about some fluid balance in the body. We've mentioned this topic here and there and kind of mentioned how blood volume influences things like blood pressure, but now we're going to talk about blood volume specifically. We'll talk about bulk flow and the force of filtration being slightly larger than the force of reabsorption, so we'll get into Starling's law of the capillary again. We'll talk about edema, and then we'll talk about some of the ways that blood volume is regulated by the kidneys, because blood volume, the heart, the kidneys, and the hypothalamus really are the ones working together to help maintain this. All right, so let's talk about fluid balance, right? What are some things going into it? What are some basic facts to kind of get us started? Number one, 2/3 of your water is intracellular, meaning it's inside of the cells. So most of your water is found inside of a cell. Another third of that, though, is found in the extracellular side, so that is going to be outside of a cell. There are two places we can be if we're outside of a cell. We can be in the interstitial fluid space, just the space between cells, or we can be part of the blood plasma. Only 20% of this makes up our blood plasma. The rest is going to be found in the space between our cells. Right. Things that will kind of influence blood volume and influence the fluid balance are things like the formation of urine, whether or not you're sweating, exhalation, we do exhale water vapor, and water intake, so how much water do you drink, how much water is in the food you eat, right? Those are things that will influence blood volume. And that this fluid is always circulating. We're in what we call dynamic equilibrium, meaning that the net movement is zero for the most part, right? The net movement is generally zero. However, that doesn't mean that nothing is moving. It just means that things are moving in a way, kind of in an equal way, right? If something's moving out of a cell, we have other stuff moving in, right? The net change is nothing, right? But there is still change happening. We just, on a surface level, when we do the math, we see that everything cancels out. So, like osmotic and hydrostatic forces, they're going to control the movement of water between the interstitial space and the capillaries, affecting blood volume, right? But that we're moving in and we're also moving out, right? So let's talk about bulk flow, right? This is kind of tying into the stuff that we talked about with the capillaries before. So basically, when we're moving water, we're looking at bulk flow. So diffusion was great for solute exchange. So moving, let's say, oxygen, carbon dioxide. Diffusion's fine for that. But bulk flow is more important when we're moving large amounts of something like water. And this is what's going to help regulate things like the volume of the blood versus the volume of the interstitial fluid. Again, capillaries in general are leaky, meaning we have movement of this fluid across the membrane. Generally speaking, we have the movement of water and smaller dissolved substances. We're not talking about large proteins, so like the albumin and stuff, like things that are like that are big, they're generally going to just stay in the blood. But water, smaller things can move through these leaks. And again, it's dependent on the hydrostatic and the osmotic pressures. So the fluid like that we move from the blood into the interstitial space is called filtration. But we also have the opposite. So when we move fluid from the blood to the interstitial space, we call it filtration. However, we don't want to like always leak out of the bloodstream. We also need to push fluid back into the blood, and that is where we get reabsorption. We're reabsorbing that fluid from the tissues back into the bloodstream, right? And we have different forces that are going to help with that. So let's go ahead and talk about that. We get a couple different things involved with this. So again, filtration is moving the fluid and solutes from the blood into the interstitial fluid. And there's two things that help drive that: blood hydrostatic pressure and interstitial fluid osmotic pressure. You may also see this listed as capillary hydrostatic pressure, right? That's how it's listed in some of the books. So you see like I will use capillary hydrostatic pressure because that's what I used in the lab and that's what's in the textbook. But capillary hydrostatic pressure and the interstitial fluid osmotic pressure, those are going to help pull things out, right? They're going to pull things from the bloodstream out into the tissue. Reabsorption is going to push things from the tissue into the blood. And so this is where we have the interstitial fluid hydrostatic pressure, which is opposite of the capillary hydrostatic pressure, and the blood colloid osmotic pressure, right, which is, again, BCOP, right? So we have like IFCOP, BCOP, those guys are opposites. CHP, IFHP are going to be opposite of each other. And so if we're taking a peek here, right, we see that in this case, hydrostatic pressure, right, from the capillaries is 32 millimeters. That's pushing things from the bloodstream out. That's going to be filtration. We see that the interstitial fluid osmotic pressure, the IFCOP, right, pushing that out of the capillary into the tissues. And then we see the opposites. We see the hydrostatic pressure of the tissues, which again is just the IFHP pushing things in, and then we see the blood colloid or the blood colloidal osmotic pressure pushing things back in, right? And it's all just looking at these numbers, like looking at these different pressures and doing the math to figure out, is there more pressure pushing things out or is there more pressure pushing things in overall? So normally we're looking at a state of near equilibrium. This is called Starling's law of the capillaries. All right, so Starling's law of the capillaries, right, can be used to calculate this. Now there's a couple ways that you can write this. In the lab, I wrote it as the net filtration pressure was the CHP minus the IFHP, all minus BCOP minus IFCOP. You can arrange this a little bit differently. So like in here we have the blood hydrostatic pressure, the capillary hydrostatic pressure, plus the interstitial fluid osmotic pressure, because those are both forces that are going to cause filtration. So in this case, we've linked filtration things together and added those forces together, all minus the total of the things that are basically pulling fluid back in for reabsorption, which is BCOP and IFHP. There's a couple ways to arrange this. So like as long as you are either adding the forces that work together and then subtracting the two forces, the two directions from each other, or you're looking at the hydrostatic pressures together, right, minusing the interstitial hydrostatic pressure from the capillary one and then minusing the interstitial osmotic pressure from the blood colloidal osmotic pressure. So there's a couple ways to write this equation. The end result is still the same, so I'm not going to get nitpicky on how you arrange things as long as you arrange them in a way that actually makes sense and gives you the correct number. Yeah, and so generally speaking, by the time we go from one end of the capillary to the other, we should have near equilibrium with this. However, sometimes this does get disrupted where we have more filtration in comparison to reabsorption. And when that happens, we end up with what we call edema, an excess fluid collection in the tissues, in the interstitial fluid space that is not being reabsorbed, right? So if we look at how things change as we go through the capillary, we see that we have more filtration happening, but as we travel down, less and less filtration, more and more reabsorption, which again gives us about a net 0, right? We're near equilibrium. We started at +8 and we ended at -7, which is again almost opposite of each other in terms of the filtration, basically the net filtration pressure, right, going from one end to the other. So again, it's not 100%. There's always going to be some fluid left behind, 10, 15% or so, but the lymphatic system has its way of helping to kind of take that excess fluid up and return it back to the cardiovascular system, right? That's just because the capillaries are not perfect. and the lymphatic system helps kind of pick up the slack. However, sometimes the lymphatic system, for whatever reason, there's a problem, there's damage to those vessels, there's damage to the lymphatic capillaries or whatever, and so we don't get that return back to the cardiovascular system, and this is where we get edema, right? Again, there's too much fluid accumulating in that interstitial space. Usually when we see this, we're talking about this happening with like limbs. Now, lymphedema is due to damage to the lymphatic system. Edema is the just excess fluids in general, right? So there's different things that can cause that buildup of fluid. So things like high blood pressure, venous obstruction, plasma proteins leaking into the interstitial space. So think about the albumin. The albumin helps draw fluid back into the bloodstream. If albumin for some reason made its way into the interstitial space, it would have that same effect by pulling fluid out of the bloodstream. This happens with things like inflammation or allergies. Mixed edema, this is a form of hypothyroidism, and as the name implies, edema, we would have edema happen with that. And again, edema in general is like a general thing, like there is fluid accumulating in the interstitial space. Whereas lymphedema is a specific form where there's damage or blockage of lymphatic vessels that is preventing that pull up of those fluids and that return of those fluids to the cardiovascular system. So let's go ahead and talk about how the kidneys contribute to blood volume. So the formation of urine, basically we are going to start by filtering fluid from the capillaries in the kidneys. We move a lot of this. We move a lot of filtrate through, 180 liters a day. However, we obviously don't produce that much urine. We produce about 1.5 liters, right? That's what gets made into actual urine, and the rest of that like 178-ish liters gets put back into the bloodstream. And there are a few things that the kidney uses to help with this process. We have antidiuretic hormone, also known as ADH, also known as vasopressin. Again, this is coming from the hypothalamus and the posterior pituitary. This is when we have high blood osmolality. Basically, we need to increase blood volume. We need to retain more water, right? Because we need to dilute solutes, let's say, in the bloodstream. And so this will help the kidney kind of reclaim water, and it will concentrate urine down. So like if you didn't have ADH being produced or not enough of ADH being produced, then you would have a lot of water in your urine. So ADH is going to help the kidneys reclaim water to concentrate the urine down. It's also going to help with making you feel thirsty. Aldosterone, this is coming from the adrenal cortex. It's one of those corticoids. This is going to be secreted when blood pressure, blood volume is reduced. So this will basically help us reabsorb salt, reabsorb water in the kidneys. So this is going to increase blood volume. So we are promoting the keeping of sodium, which will draw water with it, which increases blood volume. Atrial natriuretic peptide or atrial natriuretic hormone, you may see either way. That works opposite of aldosterone. So basically the atria have receptors, these little stretch receptors that when blood volume is high, that will cause a bigger stretch. And so then the atria can be like, hey, we are stretching too much, release the ANH. And ANH will inhibit ADH, and it'll inhibit aldosterone, which means we will get rid of more sodium in the urine, and in turn, more sodium in the urine will draw more water into the urine as well. So this will reduce blood volume. So ANH and aldosterone are basically opposites, right? They're antagonistic to each other. And then the sympathetic nervous system, this is going to increase the stimulation of the heart and decrease stimulation of the kidneys. So kidney arterioles will dilate. This will increase blood flow through the glomerulus, which will increase urine production.